Hello, I'm Andy Oliver, the Minister of Pastoral Care at Portland First United Methodist Church. Could we worship God and still experience suffering? Could God's care be tied to who God is and not the circumstances of our lives? There's a story in the Gospel of John, a book in the Bible, chapter 9, where Jesus is walking along and notices a man who has been born blind. It's as if Jesus stumbles across the blind man, unaware of his existence until that moment. Jesus' disciples take the opportunity to explore the themes of sin and suffering, presumably in the presence of this man, by asking, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? I was always struck by the apparent callousness of Jesus and his disciples in this story. To be born blind in this society was to endure suffering as separation. Indeed, the disciples themselves defined the man's blindness as a sign of sin, either in his life or the life of his parents, a view the man's religious leaders also promote later on in the story. Can you imagine what this man's life was like from the time he was born into becoming an adult, the amount of suffering that he endured, so that his very existence was seen as a sign of sin? Did he have playmates who came over to play? Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. Wow, what a painful object lesson for the man. Couldn't there have been another way to reveal God's works without the lifetime suffering of this man? Indeed, it continues to be bad for the man even after Jesus heals him. Because Jesus heals the man, the religious leaders, in their opposition to Jesus, question the man and eventually throw him out of his synagogue. The man is of no consequence to the religious leaders, and so they expel him. Truth be told, the man is a pawn, a proxy, in the greater battle between Jesus and the religious leaders, in the greater battle of Jesus' identity. In other words, the man continues to endure suffering through excommunication from his religious community even after he's no longer blind. Later on, Jesus finds the man, reveals to the man Jesus' identity as the Son of Man, and the man responds by worshiping Jesus. Notice that Jesus does not take away the man's suffering at this point. The man's suffering due to exile, away from his religious community, presumably for life. But Jesus does use a title for himself, Son of Man, which reveals that Jesus himself has entered the human arena and the vulnerability that comes with being alive. Jesus is God who has entered the arena of suffering and who suffers with us. The man, upon hearing Jesus' title, immediately worships Jesus, though his suffering has not been taken away. It's as if the man's circumstances, which were so crucially important to the man, do not impact the existence of God and the fact that we were created to worship God. Suffering does not mean that God has abandoned us, nor that we have banished God because of something we did or did not do. Indeed, Jesus chose to reveal himself to the man and not the religious leaders. The man's blindness, its impact on his personal day-to-day life, is of crucial importance to the man, but it does not change God's existence nor the need to worship. Circumstances of the man's life seem secondary to that for which we were created to be. What if God cares about this world with an intimacy not based on our necessities, but rather on God's identity? What if God is as close to us as the air we breathe, regardless of the circumstances of our life? I had a seminary teacher who spent 8 years in the countryside of Colombia, gathering the stories and testimonies of subsistent farmers who lived in extreme suffering. And they suffered because they were poor, and they suffered because of the violence around them. They were completely vulnerable to more powerful men who had guns. And the people were constantly harassed and raped and tortured and murdered, their farmlands destroyed for decades. One day, my professor interviewed a lay pastor who had been tortured, but then released by his captors, and there was no rhyme or reason to this. Many of his compatriots had been tortured and murdered, and there was no reason as to why he was tortured nor why he was released. The man told my professor, "We do not use the word hope here in the countryside of Colombia. Because hope believes that things will get better. We have no hope that things will get better. We worship God and follow Jesus. What he was saying is that the circumstances of their lives, and the lives of their parents, and the lives of the grandparents, and the lives of their children bear witness that things will not get better. And yet, they were created to worship God. We worship God because that is who God is, and who, as God's creatures, we are created to do, and that may or may not impact the circumstances of our lives. The lives of those farmers are lived in suffering, and it's pretty clear they will die in suffering. The circumstances of our lives, in this case the end of suffering, is necessary for us, but not for God. Human needs do not stop being needs just because those in policy-making power deny those needs to others. We worship God because that is who we're created to be, and that may impact our vocation, it may impact who we marry, or if we even get married, it may impact our children, it may impact suffering, or it may not impact any of this. Whatever God is up to in the world may have little to do with the things that are necessary and important to us. However, and it's a big however, the fact that God may not be as involved in these circumstances in the manner we want does not lessen the necessity of them for us. It does mean that God's presence or absence is not dictated by them. Hope is a word that people can use when they think they can make things better. Or hope is a word people use when they assume God must make things better. It indicates that God can only be involved if the circumstances of our lives improve. We blame God if we suffer. How could God not care about us? What if God's care or existence is not contingent on the circumstances of our lives? The greatest example for God's care would be for her son. God cares about Jesus, but Jesus suffers unto death. The care of God is not wiped out because of the suffering, and the suffering is not a sign of the person's sin. Jesus is clear that man's blindness is not responsible, that he is not responsible for his own blindness. It could be that God is involved in our lives in ways that do not involve the necessity of our lives. It is necessary that we have food and clean water and air. It is necessary that we have justice. It is necessary that we work with dignity. It is necessary that we care for others and our planet. However, these necessities of ours are not necessary for God in order for God to still be God and for us as God's creatures to worship this God. So we go to worship each Sunday. God may or may not show up in the manner we think God has to show up. We worship anyway because that is who God created us to be. And then we go out and we love our children and the children of our enemies, and we extend compassion and we speak out for justice and mercy. If God wants to use us, then God is powerful enough to use us, despite the circumstances of our lives or the choices we have made. And if God does not use us like we think God should, we still are God's creatures, created to worship her anyway. Thank you.